All right, so I'd also like to say thank you for the invitation for being here, and thank you very much for pronouncing my name right. That is a rarity with a name like Akwasi Owusu-Bempah, so I'm going to recognize that right now. I am a criminologist from the University of Toronto. The majority of my work focuses on the intersections of race, crime, and criminal justice with a particular emphasis on policing. And as I've been noting to people, I didn't come at this line of work directly from a drug policy or drug research standpoint, but it's very difficult to examine race and policing in any context, Canadian, American, European, without focusing also on drugs. So, first of all, one of the main things that I want to do in this talk is debunk a myth that we do not have issues of race and criminal injustice here in Canada as we do in the United States. As a matter of fact, in 2014, a black man was more likely to be stopped and searched by the Toronto police than he was stopped and frisked in New York while a major lawsuit was going on around stop and frisk. And this, of course, is also translated into the policing or as a product of the policing of drugs. Now, Canada has always had racialized drug laws. We stood very much at the forefront of drug laws with the introduction of the Opium Act, but this really started before in relation to alcohol. And while alcohol was widely used and available amongst the European settler population, it was initially criminalized for Aboriginal people. So Aboriginal people generally, and then particularly those on reserve, were prohibited from using alcohol. Subsequently, as I've noted, the Opium Act of 1908 came into force largely because of the danger or the supposed threat that Chinese migrants and Chinese Canadians posed to white labor at the end of the completion of the Canadian Pacific Railroad. And while cannabis was somewhat surprisingly criminalized in the early 1920s, we can point to a piece in Emily in The Black Candle that talked about the Negro menace right around the time that cannabis itself was criminalized. Now, we haven't had much discussion about kind of law enforcement today, but as way of a bit of background, as I've noted, cannabis was initially criminalized in 1923. We saw very little in the way of enforcement of cannabis laws through the 40s, 50s, up until the 1960s, where we saw a surge in enforcement. And we've had these kind of peaks and valleys in terms of support for legalization as well as the enforcement of the drug. And so, of course, in the 1970s, as was discussed this morning with the Ledane Commission, we saw a little bit of promise that cannabis may be legalized. It was certainly proposed. Legalization was proposed. Unfortunately, it didn't happen. And in the 1990s, we saw a surge, partly perhaps based on what was happening south of the border, but a surge in drug law enforcement generally and in cannabis law enforcement in particular. And we can kind of see, I don't know how much of that you can see from the back, but this spans from the late 1970s, 1977 through to 2013. And you can see high rates, the bottom are charges for supplying cannabis. The orange bar is possession, and then the total at the top. And as you can see, cannabis possession offenses, of course, accounting for the great majority of cannabis-related, drug-related charges generally, but cannabis-related charges in this country in particular. And we saw that, as I've noted, kind of decrease and then increase rapidly through the 1990s. So again, one of the things that I want to make very clear is that Canada has been waging its own war on drugs, as the United States did. This has very much also been a war on cannabis. And we saw Stephen Harper introduce a number of mandatory minimum sentences around the cannabis plant itself, right, related to the production of a certain number of plants, 6 or more, as well as possession of certain quantities for the purpose of trafficking. Now, I started off by noting that the drug law has been heavily racialized. In Canada, unlike the United States, the United Kingdom, our criminal justice agencies do not systematically release race-based data. So south of the border, we can look to the FBI statistics to show us the race of individuals who are arrested and convicted of offenses. In the United Kingdom, the Home Office systematically collects and releases race-based justice data. In Canada, we do not have access to that data. Our justice agencies, particularly the police and correctional agencies, do collect this data, but they do not make it readily available. Historically, the argument was that if the data were made public, that it could be used to further stigmatize already marginalized populations. So it would fuel stereotypes and the like. Now, I argue, and others certainly support this view, that it protects the criminal justice system and the state itself. If we don't have data showing racial disparities in justice outcomes, then the government and these justice agencies do not have problems that they have to deal with. We can thank our actually major news outlets with enlightening us about racial disparities in justice outcomes. So I'm thinking of Jim Rankin, a reporter at the Toronto Star, who's done a lot to cover race and policing generally, and very recently race and cannabis arrests. So I'm quite good friends with Jim, and I kind of quietly suggested to him over lunch one day, why don't you request cannabis arrest statistics from the Toronto Police Service so we can see what things look like. He'd done so about a decade before, but we didn't have anything more recent than the late 1990s, and he did so. And his series that ran in the Toronto Star over the summer showed it was African Canadians or Black Torontonians that were disproportionately arrested for minor cannabis possession. What they did in their analysis was they removed anyone that had a previous criminal record or who was found in possession for the purpose of trafficking or of large quantities. So it focused only on those offenses for which the police have the most amount of discretion. And I can assure you, every single day in this country, the police come across individuals who are possessing small or perhaps even not so small quantities of cannabis, and they are letting them go. What Jim's work showed that while African Canadians or blacks comprised 8.4% of the Toronto population, they were 25% of individuals arrested for cannabis possession offenses. And we had former chief of the Toronto Police Service, Bill Blair, open up the day today. One of the most interesting things to note is that cannabis possession offenses arrests increased in tandem with the practice of carding. So carding is when the police stop and search individuals or when they stop individuals and they want to collect information about them, not in relation necessarily to a specific criminal event, but just for information gathering purposes. They document that in a database that they then use for their own internal purposes. Well, under Blair, carding was used as a performance measure. So individual officers, as well as their supervisors, were evaluated on the number of contact cards that that individual officer, as well as that unit filled out. So we saw this rise, this increase in carding, of course, because people are being measured on their performance here, and we also saw an increase in arrests. So Bill Blair, who was here earlier talking about how he would like to perhaps after this law comes into effect, explore the possibility of amnesty, is himself responsible for the criminalization of the individuals noted here. Now, one of the things that the STAR analysis did not have was any Indigenous or Aboriginal related data. So I recently partnered with a reporter from Vice News who's been writing a little bit about this, Rachel Brown, and she requested cannabis arrest statistics from across the country. So from Vancouver, Edmonton, Calgary, Regina, Ottawa, as well as Halifax. And she recently produced a series similar to the STAR had done, breaking down these numbers across the country. So, can you guys at the back see those figures at all okay? I'll run through these relatively quickly, but I'm using their images because they're relatively clear. So here we have Vancouver. We've got the black population, this black, so I'll go from the left. The Aboriginal population in Vancouver sits at 2.5% of the general population. That's the yellow bar. The black population is 1.2% of the overall population. That's the black bar. And the white population, 48 or 49% of the overall population, the gray bar. So what we can see is those bars are the rates of arrest for each of those groups within the jurisdiction, and the lines going across, which you can't really see because black and indigenous people are such a small amount of the population, you can see the differences there, right? So Aboriginals, as I noted, in 2015, 2.5% of the population, 17 or so percent of the arrests. What we see across these years is that it is the black and the indigenous population that are greatly overrepresented in cannabis possession arrests, whereas the white population is underrepresented. The same goes for Edmonton across these years. Are these slides to be shared? They'll be available online?
Certainly make them available.
So I'll make these available rather than running through each one of the figures because it's the end of the day. I should have done a 7th inning stretch before I started. But these figures really speak for themselves. We see the same thing in Edmonton. We see the same thing in Regina. We see that some of the most stark differences in Regina with respect to the overrepresentation of the Indigenous population in the arrests vis-a-vis their representation in the general population. In Ottawa, likewise, and also in Halifax. So, a couple of caveats. This is using census data. One of the arguments is often, well, that tells us very little about like who's using or who's using publicly. Other research I've been involved in shows that in the Canadian context, much like in America, individuals of different racial groups use cannabis at relatively similar rates. So we can, in a sense, debunk that. What we don't have is access to data indicating where people use. So we know that Indigenous people, and certainly African Canadians in major cities, are more likely to be impoverished and perhaps live in multi-family dwellings, so in apartments. People that use in apartments, and especially young people, are often pushed into the streets to use their cannabis, increasing the likelihood that they're going to come into contact with the police. But what this tells us is that Indigenous Canadians, as well as African Canadians, have been disproportionately harmed by Canada's war on drugs, as have populations south of the border. So this means that they've got more likely to have a criminal record. A criminal record decreases your chance of successfully completing your education, of gaining meaningful employment, of volunteering, and importantly, of course, in the Canadian context, of traveling south of the border. So these populations have, without a doubt, disproportionately borne or experienced the harms of Canada's war on drugs. So as we move towards legalization, we may have, until Hannah got up earlier, thought, okay, well, you know, everything's going to be good once that cannabis is legal. No, it's not. There will be more laws around the plant after legalization than there are currently, and these are particularly of concern in relation to youth. As has been noted a couple of times, the penalties for providing or trafficking cannabis to youth are going to be very strict. Where do young people get their cannabis off? They're not going to, you know, necessarily elderly people. They're probably buying off their peers, meaning that these racialized young people who are engaged in the drug trade potentially face the serious consequences related to these harsher punishments. So you did a great job, Hannah. I won't, again, go through these in any great detail, but this is a breakdown of legalized jurisdictions: Colorado, Washington, Alaska, and Washington, D.C. All of these show that even though overall rates or numbers of arrests go down, that the racial disparities in arrests, if they do not stay the same, they actually increase. So in Colorado, for example, for youth, whereas white youth experienced about a 20% decrease in rates of arrests, that went up by 20% for Latino youth and 50% for black youth. Decriminalized jurisdictions, Chicago showing the same thing. I've got a great data set from Chicago I'm working with right now, as well as California. New York hasn't legalized or decriminalized, but they have seen a drastic depolicing, and as Politico and others recently reported, we see the same thing happening in New York. So, again, Hannah pointed out, a lot of these disparities are fueled by the nature of policing generally. I made reference to Bill Blair's push to card discriminatory or racist police stop and search practices, as well as the exercise of discretion, who police decide they will let go versus who they process formally, without a doubt influence these outcomes that I've discussed before. So we're not going to see a reduction in racial disparities in cannabis arrests if we do not deal with the broader problems of racism within our police services. What can we do, though, moving forward? Again, you did a fantastic job of touching upon some of these. I'll make them relevant to the Canadian situation. First of all, pardons or amnesty. Initially, the government was firm that no amnesty or pardons were not going to happen. Now they're certainly softening up on that, and this is nice to see. One of the things, though, that I would like to see is not only amnesty or a pardon for a cannabis possession offense, but any administrative charges that came from that, so a breach of probation or something related. Because what happens is an individual gets a minor cannabis charge. They're not going to jail for your first, cannabis possession offense, but you might get a set of conditions posed upon you. For example, if you're given probation for a couple of years, and then individuals slip up, so they're caught out after curfew. If they live in a heavily policed neighborhoods, many people in those neighborhoods may have criminal records, meaning it's hard not to associate with other people with criminal records and the likes. I've, for a number of times, said before that I do believe that cannabis is a gateway drug, but a gateway into the criminal justice system. And it's exactly through these administrative charges and the likes that individuals get wrapped up in the system and goes from there. So not only should there be pardons for the initial possession offense, but any administrative charges that have come from those. The redistribution of tax revenue, we heard about some great initiatives here. I think that these also need to be very focused and tailored so that individuals who have been harmed, who themselves have cannabis possession records, and those communities have priority access to these funds. And they're not difficult to identify the neighborhoods. The Toronto Star created a number of maps showing exactly who was and where the over-policing happened. And we're seeing this, again, taking place in jurisdictions like California. And then finally, cannabis industry participation. First and foremost, individuals who have especially minor cannabis-related offenses must not be precluded from or excluded from the illicit market. That's like adding insult to injury. We over-police a population, and then we exclude them from profiting from the illicit market. But beyond that, I think there are things that industry themselves can do. If we think about, we've heard before, the idea that many of the licensed producers and those in the industry now are white men with MBAs. Well, yes, this is a complex regulatory framework that they're navigating, and you need large amounts of funds to start these businesses. But what they do have is the knowledge, the know-how that could be used in the context of mentoring programs, and here I'm thinking of colleges and universities and community centers partnering with cannabis organizations, large and small. We're going to see micro-producers soon, to help diversify the industry moving forward. That's about the end of my talk. I appreciate you guys listening and welcome any comments.